Hello YouTube! So, we are standing in Brooklyn looking at the gorgeous Manhattan Bridge. There in the background is the Brooklyn Bridge, which I feel always overshadows the Manhattan Bridge. But today, we are going to give this bridge the love it deserves. And yes, that means we will walk across it, and I will show you why it is something you should consider as well, if you haven't done so yet. Crossing onto the Manhattan side, we will make a quick stop at the beautiful approach to the bridge and one additional place called the Collect Pond Park, which has a fascinating history. So work began on the bridge in 1901, and originally it was simply referred to as Bridge Number 3, as Brooklyn Bridge was opened in 1883 and the Williamsburg Bridge 20 years later in 1903. Eventually Manhattan became the name and it opened to the public on December 31st, 1909, taking about 8 years to finish. It was the third longest suspension bridge in the world, and in many respects, it was a very unique bridge. For instance, the first of such scale to use Joseph Milan's, an Austrian engineer, deflection theory, which in really simple terms is a calculation of how the deck of a bridge and cables work together under pressure. So essentially how much the bridge would move or deflect, in other words, under the weight of not just the bridge itself, but also additional weight created by things like people and cars moving across it. This was important because it essentially allowed for the creation of lighter bridges, with less material being used to stiffen the bridge. Hence, in Manhattan Bridge, you see these rather slim towers compared to, let's say, the Brooklyn Bridge, which is a little bit more massive. And in general, less material was used in the bridge's design to stiffen the whole structure. So before we actually get on the bridge itself, I recommend taking like a small stroll through the neighborhood in Brooklyn by the bridge, which is called Dumbo, named after the bridge itself, Dumbo, which stands for Down Under the Manhattan Bridge Overpass. And here you can see the bridge from below and just how massive it is, and to me at least, gorgeous design. Right here you see the arches, which many times are booming with life and activity under them, for example, like a flea market. But also when you look at the old photos of Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan Bridge, you see the different factories and warehouses that used to be located next to the bridges. Well, on some streets, you still get a feel of how things used to look like 100 years ago. Like here, for example, you see the tracks running on the street, which used to connect everything together like conveyor belts, with the bridge being visible right there in the background, and the Brooklyn Bridge right behind it. That's cool. But you know me by now, I need to walk across this bridge, and I was actually excited about this part because it's been years since I walked across the Manhattan Bridge. To some extent, this was kind of a new experience for me because honestly I don't even remember the last time I did this. But since I began this channel, I walked over and did videos on many bridges at this point: Brooklyn Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge, the RFK Bridge, Kosciuszko Bridge, George Washington Bridge, High Point Bridge, and a few other smaller ones. And at this point, I think I'm making it my mission to eventually walk across all the bridges in the city, certainly all the major ones. Here you see the subway tracks. Now, most people don't realize just how busy this bridge actually is. It has 2 levels. The upper level, which will be above us as we are crossing the bridge, it holds 4 car lanes, 2 lanes on each side of the bridge. And then the lower level, we have the pedestrian walkway, which we are on. Next to us will be 2 subway tracks, 3 car lanes in the middle, and then on the other side, 2 subway tracks again, and a bicycle path. So, to sum it up, 4 subway tracks, 7 car lanes, pathway for people to walk on, and a bike lane. So it's a bridge full of life and traffic. But look at the views you will get from the bridge. They are just amazing. Whether it's looking down on the streets below on the Brooklyn side, or checking out the traffic flow on the BQE, one of the major highways running through Brooklyn, or walking a little bit further on the bridge, you can see the fantastic views of Lower Manhattan and the Brooklyn Bridge. Here is a section you saw earlier from the street level of that arch, and even though I love the details, it's New York City and it just wouldn't be complete without the graffiti, which I just hate to see on something like this, but yeah. What I really like about this bridge is the attention to the small little details and all the different ornaments throughout the design, which you begin to really appreciate once you observe it a little bit more closely. And here we have some important information about the bridge, like the architects and people involved, but it's kind of hard to see it all as it's covered by work of true artists of modern day, right? But two things. First, as you walk on the bridge, on the right side, just below the subway tracks, you are next to a pretty big gap where you can see the water and the towers below, which is kind of cool. But second, you have that subway running right next to you, so whenever the subway goes past you, the noise can certainly get pretty loud. I mean, the trains are not traveling fast through the bridge, but still, a lot of noise and vibrations do get generated, so just get ready for that. But honestly, that annoyance gets overshadowed by the beautiful views you can focus on the other side. I mean, look at this. And as everyone gets on the Brooklyn Bridge and you are basically walking shoulder to shoulder with others while trying not to get run over by the bicycles and the e-bikes, here on the Manhattan Bridge, it's pretty empty. I mean, sure, there are people running and going past you, but compared to Brooklyn Bridge, this is empty. You can have a party here with all this room, and you can enjoy the city views. Here, already on the Manhattan side, you can see the FDR Drive, which goes around Manhattan. And look at that! No traffic, both directions. The only time I do not need to use it during the day, and it's kind of empty. But from this side, not only do you have a great view of the Lower Manhattan, but also the neighborhood and the streets below, just like on the Brooklyn side. And as we finally get to Manhattan, let me show you the Manhattan approach to the bridge itself, which is really awesome. It was created by the architecture firm of Carrere and Hastings, who designed many other iconic places in the United States, and in New York City, they also did things like the Grand Army Plaza on Fifth Avenue right by Central Park, and the main branch of the New York City Public Library, also on Fifth Avenue, in which I spent many hours during my undergraduate days, and something I still need to do a video on, because if you are in the city, it is just a must-see place. The design is actually inspired by Porte Saint-Denis in Paris and St. Peter's Square in Rome by Gian Bernini. Here you see a winged male figure representing the spirit of industry, and on the other side of the arch there is a female winged figure representing the spirit of commerce, trade. And above the arch itself there are Indians, Native Americans, hunting buffalo. But in general, when you look closely, everything really has nice detailed designs. And here is the view of Manhattan from the approach. Cars come right onto Canal Street, and so let us walk a little bit on Canal Street to the Collect Pond Park, as I would like to mention a little bit of history behind it. But in general, this is an area I will revisit at some point in the future, as it's the neighborhood of Chinatown and there is just so much history here. that it's impossible to mention everything in one short video. But here we are at the Collect Pond Park. In this area of Manhattan, there used to be a large freshwater pond. When New York City was just a small town on the tip of Manhattan, the pond itself used to serve as a place for fishing and drinking water, as the pond itself was supplied by natural springs from below, and so wells were used to tap into that clean spring water which supplied the pond itself. In the late 1700s, things like slaughterhouses, for example, and other businesses moved around the pond, eventually polluting the water, and not only making it dangerous to drink out of those wells, but also transmitting diseases through things like mosquitoes, which use the pond as their paradise. But still, supposedly one of the earliest steamboat designs was tested on the Collect Pond by John Fitch. Although there is information in Collect Pond Park which states that this is not proven and potentially it did not happen. Which to me is really interesting because any book I came across, or even any online source, mentioned that it did happen. And in fact, even New York City's park website says that it did happen. So I have to do a bit more investigating myself, as I would love to teach a course on New York City once again in the future, which is something I didn't do in a while. So it's small things like this that keep me awake at night, and I want to make sure I do not give the wrong information to my students once I'm inside of my classroom. In 1803, it was voted to drain the pond, and so a canal was dug from the pond to the Hudson River to hopefully drain the pond. However, that plan didn't really work. And so by 1820s, the pond was filled in with soil from the surrounding hills, but eventually it began to be filled in with really anything just to cover it up, including more garbage. And, things like dead animals, because, well, why not? Of course, all of that combined into a quagmire. It's like trying to make a stew on all the leftover food that you have in your fridge. You hope for the best and you throw everything into the pot, but eventually what you're really creating is the world's most powerful laxative. Halfway through, even your dog was hiding, knowing better not to try your cooking experiment. So that's kind of what happened to the pond at the end as well. And the canal was also covered up, and hence, Canal Street was born. That's why we have the name. But the land on this part of the city was really bad. It sank, it smelled, and eventually became an area known as the 5 Points, a densely populated, disease and crime-filled slum of New York City, where many buildings would sink and have foundation problems due to the land on which they were built on. Even today, the Supreme Court building, which you see right here, and other buildings have pumps to keep their basements dry. In fact, it's kind of a very interesting topic. For instance, New York City subway system also has the same problem, as its tunnels are surrounded by groundwater in many places. And so millions of gallons of water are pumped out of the subway system every single day. Hence, when it rains hard, all of a sudden, things begin to flood and there are major delays and closures because the pumps and the whole system itself is just overwhelmed. Hence, water is something that the city has to deal with every single day, whether it's in the subway system or buildings and neighborhoods such as this one, which stand on top of the old Collect Pond. Again, this area is definitely something I'm gonna revisit again in the future at least once, because there's a lot of things here to show you. But for now, the Collect Pond is something I just had to mention, as it was on my mind the whole time I was walking across the Manhattan Bridge. Like always, I hope you enjoyed this short video and I got to show you a little bit more of the city itself. And like always, stay safe out there and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.